Next, we have the intro to genetics. We're just going to make sure we get some key terms down here, and they're bolded in the lesson, but I just want to talk through them and give you a different. So a gene is a segment of your DNA that codes for a specific, what we call phenotype or appearance. So the gene is responsible for, there's a whole fields of science that are about how do we go from the gene to the protein. And we'll go into that a little bit later in the semester, but we'll just keep it simple and say a segment of DNA that codes for a physical trait or a trait in some way. And that is what we call phenotype. Alleles are differing forms of that same gene. So for example, we could think of a gene as a segment of DNA is the recipe for a cookie. And I can have an allele that calls for chocolate chips to be put into the cookie. So the genes give me the cookie, then I have the form that gives me chocolate chips. And then there are some sick, twisted individuals out there who like to make others feel really bad, who put raisins into cookies. So that's a different allele. So we have the chocolate chip allele and the raisin allele. Both of them are giving us a cookie. That gene codes for cookie. I could have the chocolate chip version, the one that everyone should want, or the raisin version that's a lie. And you, so that's the idea of the relationship between gene and allele, right? Gene is, we have a recipe for a cookie, and then I have these different forms of that cookie that I can produce, which would be the alleles. Each individual that are part of a diploid organism, like humans are, diploid means we have 2 copies of every gene. So I could have a copy of the chocolate chip recipe or the allele, and I could have a copy of the raisin, right? I could have 2 chocolate chip alleles. I could have 2 raisin alleles. So I have these different, what we call genotypes, these different patterns of it. In the fruit flies, we had red eyes versus dark eyes. And so the red allele and the dark allele are there. And you could have 2 red alleles, you could have 2 dark alleles, or you could have the in-between. If you have 2 of what we call the dominant allele, a dominant allele means that if I have one of each, that's a heterozygous genotype. The genotypes are the sets of alleles that you have 2 of each, right? So a heterozygous individual, for if they have a red eye and a dark eye allele, will have a red physical appearance, a red phenotype. That tells us that this is the dominant allele because it shows up versus the recessive allele, which does not, when both are present. So the dominant allele and the recessive allele, when they're together, that's how we know which one's dominant and recessive. If I just have 2 of the red eye alleles, that's called homozygous. If I know that it's dominant, I can call it dominant homozygous, but I don't know that until I've seen an individual that I know has one of each. I also can have 2 of the dark eye alleles, so that would be homozygous recessive. So we have phenotype, which is what's the physical appearance, right? The dominant physical appearance or the recessive physical appearance. Then I have genotype, where I can be homozygous dominant because I have 2 of the dominant alleles, heterozygous because I have 1 of each, or homozygous recessive because I have 2 of the recessive alleles. So we want to be familiar with that terminology. So the question here is, so are alleles just types of genes? Yeah, they're a form of a particular gene, right? So eye color is the gene, and you can have the red allele or the dark allele. So it's differing forms of the recipe for eye color. Terminology here. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that you have 2 of each allele 2 alleles of each gene. When you go to reproduce, you only get to pass on one of your two to a particular offspring. You can't pass both of them on to the same offspring. So that's the law of segregation. We must segregate your two alleles. Now, we have no way of knowing which of your two will go to a particular offspring. It's a random chance. And so when we're setting up a genetic problem, when we're doing a Punnett square, the reason why we put both of your alleles on there is because both are equally possible of being passed on to the offspring. And so if you were heterozygous and you had a red allele and a dark allele for eye color, we have to set up the Punnett square where you can pass on. That's why we have the 2x2 box, right? So we have parent one, they could pass on the big R or the little r, and then we have parent two, who's going to be the vertical axis, who could pass on the big R or the little r if they're both heterozygous. And we have to do that possible combination. So the law of segregation says we need to separate those as we go to form an offspring. We can only pass one of them on, and that's the same for both parents. And so when we're doing a Punnett square, we're really just setting up doing all the possible combinations that a pair of individuals could produce. Yes, Austin, go ahead.
So using eye color as like the gene example, what if there's like, I mean, there's certainly more than two eye colors. So is the idea in every single person, you can only possess two different types of eye color that you could potentially pass on?
Correct. And human eye color gets a little bit tricky. So it's actually, there's not one gene that controls it. There's multiple genes that control it. So the first gene, we'll think of this as, do you put pigment in your eye? Okay. If you do, then we go on to the second gene that controls which color it is, right? Whether you get kind of hazel eyes or green eyes or brown eyes. But if you don't have the dominant allele, if you have two recessive alleles for that first gene, you don't get any pigment. And the color that shows up if you don't get pigment is blue. So eye color is a little bit tricky in that case. So hopefully you kind of see how that like kind of builds on itself, right? First gene, do I get pigment? If I don't get pigment, I get blue eyes. If I do get pigment, then it goes on to the second gene, which then there can be more than one or more than two alleles, right? I can have an allele for green eyes, blue eyes, hazel eyes, 3 alleles, right? Now, as an individual, I only get 2 of those. But there can be more than 2 options for the 2 that I get.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you would never have like an uppercase R, lowercase r, cursive R or something. I mean, it's only gonna be 2, right?
Yeah, just be the 2 that you end up with.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next part that I want to talk about is the law of independent assortment. And what we see here is that we have, instead of just one trait, we're looking at eye color and fruit flies. We're also looking at wing shape here. So eye color and wing shape together. Now all of a sudden that's a little bit trickier, right? Because we're not looking at just 2 alleles for each individual. We're looking at 2 alleles for eye color and 2 alleles for wing shape. And those 2 are not tied together necessarily. They independently assort from one another. That means that, let's say these top 2 here are our parents here, okay? The big R from this parent can go to either of these 2 big ends. And this big R could go with either of these 2 ends. So when we're making our Punnett square here, we have to do all the possible combinations. So for example, this third genotype here, we could have when we're forming the gametes, when we're making sperm or egg, this individual could pass on the big R and the big N together. They could pass on the big R and the little n together. We're still doing the law of segregation, right? You're only getting one R and one N, but we don't know which ones are going to be paired together in that sperm or egg. You could have the little R with the big N, little R with the little N. So because of that, the way that this third genotype plays out, you could have 4 different types of gamete forms, gamete being sperm or egg, from this genotype. And that would mean that we need to have 4 columns in our Punnett square for that individual. And so that's the law of independent assortment, that I need to account for the eye color and the wing shape. Those alleles will independently assort rather than just say, oh, the dominants are always together or the recessives are always together. This is going to come up next week as well. But just to kind of a little primer of the 2 main laws that Mendel came up with, the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. All right, and I think we got all the terminology we needed there. This last part, probability, is kind of important to think about. It's going to help us set up our next lesson here. When we are okay with an event taking place, we don't care how the order of the event. We have these 2 events that we want to take place, but we don't care about the order. That's going to cause us to add the 2 probabilities together. So let's say we want to get a boy and a girl out of our first 2 children. Well, what's the probability that we're going to have either a boy or a girl in that first generation, first child? It's 100%, right? And then what's the probability we will then get the opposite? Now that's going to be a little bit tricky. Because, well, if I had a girl, what's the probability I would then have a boy second? Well, now that's 50%, right? And then what's the probability that I would have a boy and then a girl? Well, that's 50%, right? So we have to then, once we get to that, we can start thinking about, I don't care how the first event takes place, because I just have to have a boy or a girl. And then I have to have the opposite, the second one. Well, it's 100% probability to start with. And then I just need to get the opposite for the second one. That's at 50%. So the probability of having a boy and a girl, then I would then bring in this rule of multiplication. I have to have the first event. I don't care which one takes place. Let's change how I'm going through this. I've probably muddled this a little bit. There are 2 ways to get a boy and a girl. I can have a boy and then a girl, or I could have a girl and then a boy. Probability of getting a boy and then a girl would be 0.25, or sorry, 0.5 for getting a boy, and then 0.5 for getting a girl. The rule of multiplication says to go boy and then girl, I'm going to have that event, those 2 events take place. I would multiply those probabilities together. So 0.5 for getting a boy times 0.5 for getting a girl gets me to 0.25. So that first way of getting a boy and a girl would be 25%. But if I don't care about the order, if I just want to have a boy and a girl, I don't care which one comes first, I could have a girl and then a boy, and that would result in the same success that we put on this, or condition that we put on this for success. So again, it would be probably you get a girl, 0.5, probably you would then get a boy, also 0.5. Those 2 events would have to take place together. So we multiply those together, and that would be 0.25. So we have the first way that we could do it, which would be boy then girl, 25% chance of that. Second way we can get there, girl then boy, that's also 25%. Because we're okay with either path, we don't care which one gets us there, we can then add those 2 probabilities together. So the 25% from one and the 25% from 2, we add those 2 together, and there's a 50% probability that we would end up with a boy and a girl. So that's kind of how these 2 laws of probability work together.